Welcome to the Church of Perpetual Life. My name is Neil Vandry and I am the officiator here, and we are live streaming and glad that you're with us. I'd like to welcome you to our event tonight. If you're here joining us for the first time, I'd like to invite you to join our email list so that you can get updates on all that is going on with the super longevity movement, and we can help you to live a longer and healthier life. You can join the email list simply by emailing me through the website at perpetual.life. Next month, we will be meeting in person at our new church in Pompano Beach with Bill Falloon giving the presentation. And we will also have the event through Zoom. Now that'll be the third Thursday next month in April. That's going to be April the 21st. Our Zoom will begin at 6 o'clock and the live stream at 7. Please join me now with our creed here at Perpetual Life. We believe that all of life is sacred and that we have been given this one life to make unlimited. We believe in our Creator's divine plan for all of humanity to have infinite lifespans in perfect health and eternal joy, rendering death to be optional. By following our gospel, we achieve eternal life, creating a heaven here on earth. We follow Nikolai Fedorov, who taught that the transcendence of the Creator will only be solved when humanity, in our unified efforts, become an instrument of universal resuscitation, when the divine word becomes our divine action. And we follow Arthur C. Clarke, who said, the only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them into the impossible. And so we enter each day energized in spirit and empowered by the words of our prophets to live in joy, serving our Creator and all of mankind forever and ever. I'd like to share with you tonight a movie clip. It's a movie that we've got coming up. It'll be opening in 2 months in May. It's Longevity Hackers. And before we show this trailer, I'd like to point out that most of the people in this clip have attended and spoken here at the Church of Perpetual Life. We're looking forward to having a movie night in the future. This will be a great film for us. So let's show the clip for Longevity Hackers.
Biggest issue that all of us are facing together is the disease of aging and the finality of death.
People for thousands of years have been touting cure aging products that don't really work.
People have to understand several things. Number one, the science is real.
Universal X Prize is a global technological competition, $100 million for developing solution to reverse aging.
All humans die, and most people accept it as a given, but more and more people are beginning to learn that it's not necessarily something that can't be changed.
We're not just talking about slowing aging, we're actually about turning back the clock.
Things are going to be exponential.
A good diet and exercise will help you avoid a lot of disease, but it's truly not enough.
If FDA will recognize aging as disease, it's going to be a massive inflection point for all of us.
Metformin's major side effect is living long. People who are aging don't have the patience to wait 10 years for a drug approval.
I'm very excited. I think that aging can be cured a lot faster than most people are projecting.
The prospect of living up to 200 years is really nothing.
And what we're seeing there is that people's dogs are going from old dogs to puppies again.
In order to be able to treat diseases of aging, we have to understand the cause.
You can't really stop aging per se, but we can significantly decelerate the process.
I wouldn't be surprised if we saw reversal of aging in every way imaginable.
Now we're treating the lifespan itself as somehow unnatural, as something that needs to be fixed. Treating aging as a disease takes us in some directions that we should think carefully about and we should worry about.
I will be able to live as long as I choose to live.
I do believe that we are now in control of our own evolution.
That looks like a really great movie. We're looking forward to having that at a movie night here in the near future. Also know that the RadFest is coming back live and in person in October. So you can register for the live event at RadFest. Just go to the radfest.com website and be sure to share this event with all of your friends and family. I understand that there are many of you around the country, around the world, that would like to have a perpetual life in your backyard. And I'd like to encourage you to create a meetup where you are and talk with me about how we can help you to do that. Our mission here at Perpetual Life is to assist all people in the radical extension of healthy human life. And we provide fellowship for longevity enthusiasts. At our regular services once a month, we have guest speakers that teach scientific rationality, along with the Creator's plan that humanity evolve to achieve markedly extended, healthy lifespans. We follow the Prophet Nikolai Fedorov's philosophy of the common task for humanity. The church, this Church of Perpetual Life, is a science and faith-based transhumanist church. Our faith is in the Creator and in humanity to find ways toward healthy, unlimited lifespans. And for the past 2 years, our services have all been virtual through Zoom. And as I mentioned, I'm very happy to say that next month we'll be coming live again. We'll be meeting again, and we'll have Bill Falloon to give a presentation. And we'll also have the Zoom presentation available as well. So for tonight's speaker, we're very excited to have David Wood, who will be talking about the abolition of aging, an update for 2022. David Wood is the chair of the London Futurists, co-founder of the Transhumanist UK, and a board member of the IEET, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's the author or lead editor of 10 books about the future, including The Abolition of Aging, Smartphones and Beyond, and Sustainable Superabundance. The most recent is Vital Foresight, the Case for Active Transhumanism. In his professional career, he spent 25 years as a pioneer of the mobile computing and smartphone industries. Before that, he spent 8 years at the University of Cambridge studying mathematics and the philosophy of science. Let's all welcome our speaker tonight, David Wood, with his presentation entitled The Abolition of Aging, an Update for 2022. David Wood.
It's a real pleasure to be here. And that was such an interesting start of the meeting. I am really looking forward to that film, The Longevity Hackers. I may not be able to come and watch it with you in Florida, but I'm sure there must be ways soon to watch it online, because that is full of interesting possibilities there. So my topic, as you heard, is the abolition of aging. I've been writing about this for quite some time, and I want to discuss the possibility of radical longevity for all by 2040. And I'm going to give a review of what I've said various times in the past, and then bring it bang up to date for March 2022, my latest assessment of the state of play. To let you know where I'm coming from, to let you know where I get my distinctive views on this subject, I'll briefly refer to the 25 years, as you heard, where I worked in the mobile computing and smartphone spaces, where I learned a lot. Not just how to write smartphone applications or create smartphones, but more generally about disruptive breakthroughs in accelerating technologies. We wrote about smartphones in our group in Symbian, or before Symbian, as early as 1995, but it took a long time before they really did have a big impact on the world. So disruption has a slow and disappointing phase, usually before this fast and furious breakthrough. And when, for example, smartphones have transformed so many fields of life in just a decade or so. I also learned that these disruptions require not just building new technology, but often building an ecosystem, a community, a network of people and companies organizations with positive feedback cycles. I learned too that disruption often happens in waves, and if we're hung up looking at one wave, we may miss even the larger things that are coming soon. And each of these new waves often brings a new organizing idea, involves new tools, and often involves new people who dare to do things differently. And the final lesson that I'll draw out from this part of my life is that the outcomes of these possible technological disruptions are by no means inevitable. And indeed, the human factors are very important in determining how quickly things happen in the end and the direction in which they go. Even before I worked in smartphones, if I look back to an early phase of my life, I really enjoyed the 4 years I spent studying the philosophy of science. You may wonder what's the relevance to today's topic. Well, philosophers of science tried to figure out principles to determine whether something that looks scientific, something that might be presented in a scientific guise, a scientific language, whether it is good science or whether it is, as we might say today, fake science, or philosophers of science would call it pseudoscience. In our field, the field we are studying today of anti-aging science, some people put these scare quote marks around it. Well, there are bits of that that are not as solid in science as we would like, but equally there are many other parts that critics will disagree with, but in my view are very sound science indeed. And I'll refer back to that later. And finally, the third part of my past life that I am bringing into this analysis is the time I have spent since 2008 building a community of people to discuss future possibilities. Recently, we reached the milestone of 9,000 members in our mailing list. We have organized and ran around 250 public events, including some of the larger events that you see there. And like the Church of Perpetual Life, for the last 2 years, we have been almost entirely online. And what I learned from all these 250 meetings, I have put into various books that I authored, 7 of these, or that I helped to edit, and the other 3. And today I'm going to look at the book on the top right, The Abolition of Aging, which I released in 2016. And in that book, I dared to look ahead 24 years to 2040. Why 2040? Well, I'll answer that shortly. But in the very beginning of the book, almost the first words, I said, it's a big if, but if we decide as a species to make this project our priority, there's around a 50% chance that practical rejuvenation therapies resulting in the comprehensive reversal of aging will be widely available as early as 2040. So that's the claim I want to look at here. Why did I think that was a reasonable claim to make? And do I think that claim still stacks up? So I went on at the beginning of that book. People everywhere on the application of these treatments will, if they wish, stop becoming biologically older. If they wish, they'll start to become biologically younger in both body and mind as these rejuvenation therapies take hold. Now, in the meantime, 6 years have passed. That's a quarter of this time period. So it's reasonable to ask if I have changed my opinion over that time. Perhaps if I was a man of simple faith, I would say, no, I'll stick with what I said these 6 years ago. But as a scientist, a philosopher, I am indeed open to change. And as you'll see at the end, I have revised my opinions in some way. But first, let's look at this phrase, a 50% chance. To be clear, I was not evaluating this with any precision. I did not claim that I had calculated this probability to 3 decimal places. That would be much too precise. I did not even claim to calculate the probability to 2 decimal places. But I was making some assertions. I was rejecting the view, common view, that this possibility would be not very likely. Indeed, if we ask a man or woman in the street who hasn't thought much about this, they will say the chances of this rejuvenation therapies being widely available by 2040 is slim. And I want to reject that. I want to say, on the contrary, that it is a serious possibility, at least a quarter. But also, I take issue with those, a few people who might say that it is a near sure thing, that technology is proceeding along some kind of inevitable trajectory. I disagree with that too. And I think that the probability is not so high as that. It's by no means certain. Now, when we get into the discussion phase of this meeting, some of you may want to take issue. Some of you may come up with arguments and say, no, here's why it's very likely we will be in that good state by 2040. Some of you may say, well, either yourself or some of your colleagues or your friends believe that it's very unlikely. So I will be open to hearing alternative arguments in due course. But I put many of these alternative arguments in my book. I weighed up, in effect, 10 arguments, and they split into two groups. There were 5 accelerators and 5 blockers. There were 5 arguments that made it more likely that we would reach radical longevity for all by 2040, and 5 arguments for why this wouldn't be likely and that we would not reach that goal. And it was because I thought these arguments were broadly evenly balanced that I came up with this figure of 50%. So I'll be interested as I go through these 10 arguments, what your assessment is, whether you think some of them are stronger than I have said, or whether some of them are weaker than I have said. So let's start in. Let's look at the largest blocker argument, the argument that most people will say, this sounds nice, but aging is just too complicated. And here's an analogy. And by the way, there will be several analogies in my presentation. This is somebody you probably don't recognize, a brilliant physicist. He said in 1955 that he predicts that a method will be found within 20 years for liberating fusion energy in a controlled manner. So I'm not talking yet about aging. I'm talking about the prediction that was made as an Atoms for Peace conference, that something would be just 20 years into the future. And because of his role in that community, a lot of people took it seriously. The next time the same community met, they weren't on Zoom in these days. They met 3 years later at another conference, and another very brilliant physicist answered that question. You may have heard of Edward Teller. He is known as one of the inventors of the hydrogen bomb. He is also said to be one of the inspirations, the role model for the figure of Dr. Strangelove, played by Peter Sellers in that long ago film. So he responded, he thought, well, to make this economically exploitable, these thermonuclear reactions may not turn out to be possible before the end of the 20th century. So he said, yeah, I like the idea, but it's probably going to take at least 40 years. So who was right? Well, even Teller, it turned out, was too optimistic. Even today, yet another 20 years later, we still seem to be perhaps 20 years away from doing that. And that's the point. This is the objection to what we are saying. Some things can be stated simply, but they turn out to be extremely complicated to accomplish, like the controlled release of energy from nuclear fusion. It's the same with something from my first love, mathematics, which I studied for 4 years before philosophy of science. There are some statements in mathematics which are very simple to state, like Fermat's last theorem. Some of you may know Pythagoras' theorem. You can get numbers like 3, 4, and 5, such that 3 squared plus 4 squared is 5 squared. Or 8 squared plus 15 squared is 17 squared. That's when n is 2 in this equation. But if n is higher, if you try to do the same thing with cubes or 4th powers or 5th powers, there seems to be no solution. But can you prove there's no solution? Well, Fermat, writing in 1637, said he knew how to prove it, but it would take a little bit too much space than would fit in the margin of the book where he was making notes. It turned out Fermat was right in one way. It was correct that there are no solutions. It took 358 years for mathematicians such as Andrew Wiles of Cambridge to prove this. And the length of their proof It didn't fit in a margin. It took 129 pages. So indeed, some things can be stated simply, hey, let's undo aging, but they turn out to be extremely complicated to accomplish. And that's the fear for aging. But I have to say, there's no impossibility proof. People have tried to show at various times reasons why aging can't possibly be reversed. They have referred to things like the Hayflick limit or Orgel's second law, which states that evolution is always cleverer than us, and if we think we can outdo evolution, we are mistaken. Well, both of these arguments we have found in the last decades are wrong. And on the contrary, there are lots of examples in nature of some creatures that do not age, and indeed of some instances of rejuvenation. Some creatures have limbs cut off, they can rejuvenate, and there is rejuvenation even inside humans when 20, 30 or 40-year-old humans give birth to new humans who have got no age at all. So it's not a matter of impossibility, it's a matter of time, a matter of scale. And maybe it's very hard. Maybe if only a few people worked on it, it might take 358 years. But the reality is many more people are working on this. And I would say that with more people cooperating well, the problem can take much less time. Indeed, if more and more people cooperate well, the problem should be solved a lot sooner. And that brings me on to the first accelerator, my observation that more and more people are indeed working on this problem constructively, productively. It started small. In the beginning of this meeting, in the Zoom discussion ahead of time, I heard of various people who were thinking about this problem in the 1970s. In reality, there was little progress until a few people in the 1980s. Here I picture Michael Rose, who did experiments extending the life of fruit flies, or the Cynthia Kenyon, who was involved with genetic modifications that extended the lives of C. elegans. They were very much a minority in these early days. And most people were told, don't go near this field. This field is a waste of time. You can't do anything significant. It's a black mark on your career if you dare to think about it. But because there were a few interesting results, more people had the courage to get involved, and possibly by the next decade, there were maybe 100 people who were doing useful and serious work in this field. And every decade since then, it's hard to measure it exactly, but my estimate that maybe 10 times as many people are, from time to time, not necessarily full-time, but they're acting as citizen scientists, or they're engaged in support of companies or organizations who are looking at this subject more seriously. By the end of this decade, I think there could be 100,000 people cooperating, and by the 2030s, 1 million people. And I think that gives us a good chance of cracking these problems comprehensively, especially since it's not just isolated people, it is some of the most powerful and successful companies ever. So there are people in Alphabet, the parent company of Google, who set up Calico. People in Microsoft have talked in interesting ways about applying their software technology to cure diseases such as cancer. Apple have said that they imagine that in the future, they will make more revenues out of the health business than even they make out of smartphones. Jeff Bezos of Amazon has invested, it seems, in anti-aging companies such as Altos Labs. Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, have also spoken in terms of enabling the solution of all diseases. And by the way, it's not just the most powerful Western IT companies. If you look at statements of the executives and founding teams of Chinese IT companies, such as Tencent and Alibaba, you can say they too are interested in this field. So that's why I think that provided these organizations can cooperate in a constructive way, we could indeed see these affordable, comprehensive, reliable therapies in wide use by 2040. But this assumes that these efforts can add up constructively. And critics will say, hang on, you can't get all these people productively cooperating. If you put 1 million cooks in a kitchen, and if the cooks have got different ideas on the best meals, you are not going to get 1 million times the food. So the second negative argument is that there may be lots of people who get excited about this field, but most of what they produce will not be of good value. The noise will swamp the signal. Useful research will be drowned in a sea of lower quality. And there's an actual phrase for this. It's called the Mythical Man Month, named after a book that was produced in the early days of the software engineering industry, 1975. My first boss inside the mobile computing industry recommended that I read this book, and it made the point that if you have 9 women cooperating, you can't get a baby born just 1 month after conception. Some things need to be done serially. And extending that argument, the view of the critics is that our community may have lots of enthusiasm, lots of people who are well motivated, but instead of cooperation, there will be elements of infighting, disagreements, personality clashes, fights over access to money, divisions and distrust between warring tribes. There will be some people who are more concerned about political correctness than moving fast. And what's this going to do overall? It's going to lead it to the broader public being alienated. They will look and they will see the appearance of big beasts fighting, again, as on the cover of that book. And that's going to lead to yet another blocker, that many people who might be interested in this field will shrug their shoulders and say, this is never going to work. You know what? We can't believe in this. We should instead reconcile ourselves to natural lifespans. And we shouldn't waste money on these egocentric approaches that are just driving selfish, immature desires. We should instead be mature and accept aging. So the public mood may turn against this effort. And there's no good pointing out the logical errors in these arguments. These things are more driven by psychology than by logic. And often it's a kind of sour grapes. People will say, well, they don't think this is possible, therefore it wasn't worth chasing after all. It would be nasty in various ways. And to round off this presentation of blockers, there is the worry that we're going to have a degradation in the ability of society to do science in any case. We are facing more social chaos, pandemics, recessions, adverse weather, wars, refugee migrations that will mess up our ability as a society to concentrate on these bigger ideas. Instead, we will be increasingly the victim of social hostility, terrorism, and outrage, political dysfunction. Fake science will flourish. And instead of moving forwards, we may move backwards. And instead of an acceleration of progress, we may see a slowing down of progress. So let me recap. Here's the bad news, which I'll write on the right-hand side of this picture. It's a very complicated field. There might be people cooperating, but they will actually interfere destructively with each other. There will be infighting and fragmentation. The general public will say, it's not a good thing to pursue. Let's put our money instead on malaria research or solving poverty and so forth. And if we're not careful, the ability of society to do big, major breakthrough projects will not be there. I've started putting the contrary view. I've talked about the possibility of having 1 million people actively engaged in the engineering of rejuvenation, so-called rejuveneers. I've pointed out that very large companies who have a big track record of success are interested. Now let me come to a third principle, which is that different ideas often make a huge difference. There is a phrase attributed to the computing science pioneer Alan Kay. I wonder if you can finish this sentence. The right perspective is worth 80 IQ points. So instead of actually needing to make ourselves cleverer, when we can see things from a different perspective, we can act as if we are much more productive and much smarter. If we're locked into a limited viewpoint, a limited general understanding, we won't see much. But when metaphorically we can reach from a higher perspective, we will go much faster. The example that Alan Kay gave was in trying to do long multiplication. It used to be that people used things like Roman numerals, trying to do this kind of long multiplication by old-fashioned style. It's pretty difficult, but when you switch to a different counting system, the Indian or Arabic system, with 0 and with digits having different meanings depending on their place, long multiplication is much easier. And more generally, if you find the right shared standards, it can be so helpful. And that's what's happened in software, by the way. Many software projects have gone much faster when they have enabled people to cooperate. Open source projects have achieved remarkable progress so that an open source operating system, Linux, is the most widely used operating system on the planet, with so many more people cooperating than was previously thought to be possible. Other examples, when Newton came along with calculus, also discovered at the same time by Gottfried Leibniz in Germany, suddenly so much of physics started to make sense and there was lots of progress. It was the same in the 1920s when there were breakthroughs with quantum mechanics, and suddenly in just a few years, there was huge amounts of progress. As one of the physicists involved then, Paul Dirac, said later, in those years, even second-grade physicists could do first-grade work. Turning more to our own subject, there were huge breakthroughs in the ability of society to tame infectious diseases when there was the development of a single point of view, the germ theory of disease, that said these diseases were caused by microorganisms that were too small to be seen by the naked eye, but could be tamed by a variety of solutions involving better hygiene, vaccinations, and antibiotics. And as a result of that, the most deadly diseases of history, tuberculosis, influenza, gastroenteritis, diphtheria, and cholera, and so on, they are much, much less serious in today's world. And that's what we rejuvenators offer, a different conception of the treatment of chronic diseases. Then rather than put lots of money into trying to cure cancer or curing heart disease or curing dementia, we have a single understanding of the fundamental causes, which is sometimes called the hallmarks of aging or the classification of types of damage. And as more people flip from thinking of an disease-first approach to an aging-first approach, it's like getting 80 extra points of IQ. So this is the emerging new idea, which can revolutionize how medical research can be done, with a momentum of funding transferring in stages to this new paradigm. But there's another point that needs to be explored here, which is as follows. That germ theory of infectious diseases might sound very interesting, but nobody could do much about it until various tools were available. Tools such as better microscopes that allowed people like Robert Koch in Germany to study the different microorganisms. Tools such as improvements with synthetic chemicals, with biochemical manipulations, tools that emerged because of the progress of the Second Industrial Revolution. Well, in the same way, this fine idea that aging is at the root of chronic diseases, it also requires the development of new tools. And these are the tools not from the Second Industrial Revolution, but from the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is still at a relatively early phase, but which is accelerating. So let me take a few moments to explain that. Now, this is a very complicated picture. I'm not going to go through all of this in any means. I write about it at length in my recent book, Vital Foresight, to help people to understand this course of industrial revolutions and why each industrial revolution is likely to have a bigger impact on the world than previous ones. But simply, you can see there the first industrial revolution with steam and mechanization leading to trains, paddle boats. The second industrial revolution, which I just mentioned, included electricity, breakthroughs with steel and synthetic chemicals, ability to automate more. The third industrial revolution, when computers started displacing humans from the workforce in the 1960s onwards, the development of integrated circuits and electronics, the cellular communications, and even before that industrial revolution has reached its maturity, it is being overtaken by the early phase of the fourth industrial revolution, which I'll describe more in a moment, the NBIC convergence. Now, all of these industrial revolutions grow out of a respect for the scientific method. They grow out of the acceptance of an open society in which people are free to criticize authorities without being sent to prison or being ostracized. It emerges from a society in which people can form lots of relationships with different people. So the first industrial revolution involved the engineering genius of James Watt in partnership with the entrepreneurial genius of Matthew Boulton, who looked after patents and business development. These industrial revolutions also depend upon some early inventions turning out to develop and deliver much more than was expected. So steam was developed first to pump water out of coal mines, and as the steam engines improved, it turned out to improve all kinds of factory situations. And it's the same with the other industrial revolutions. And the reason they all accelerate is because, I've mentioned it already, of feedback cycles. Initially, each industrial revolution had relatively crude tools, but the technology that was developed allowed better tools, which allowed better technology. So computers allowed the design and manufacturing of better computers. It also features feedback cycles between technology and people. Technology make people more powerful and more capable and allow them to develop more technology. Not just at an individual level, but technology allows more people to cooperate. Technology such as the one we're using in this very call, connecting people from at least 3 continents into this discussion, and more educational systems. So that all drives what? It drives technological change, which brings so many opportunities to improve human life, improve our health, our education, our housing, our access to consumer goods, our well-being. That is the most important story in all of history, by some accounts. We might like to study kings and queens and presidents, but this is the biggest story of all, the industrial revolutions. At the same time, these industrial revolutions have some risks involved. They bring the possibility of greater damage to the environment, damage to human relationships. They encourage different types of crime. There were train robberies, which allowed people to steal more money than ever before. And nowadays there is malware as a service, allowing people to execute crimes against millions of people in parallel. And there is likelihood of more terrible wars exploiting this. So the industrial revolutions are, I can say, two-edged swords, and they can lead to social chaos as well to social advantage. And the risk of that social chaos, look at the bottom of this picture, is it will destroy the openness and the respect for science, which makes that progress possible. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let's dive more into this health aspect. And let me explain what this NBIC convergence is. Probably most of you know what these letters stand for. N is nanotech. It allows the atomically precise operation, in due course, nanoscale assembly factories, manipulation of atoms. B is for biotech, which allows us to reprogram not just our devices, but to reprogram our biology, our genes, our epigenomes. I is for infotech. It's not just computing with bits and communicating with bits. That's third industrial revolution. But what's different now is we have machine learning. We have machines that write software, or AI that writes software. And C, cognotech, is manipulation and improvement of our brains, our neurons. So briefly, the three ways in which this fourth industrial revolution differs from what happened before is we have computing, but not just in computers. We have computing in a very wide variety of different kinds of devices, so-called Internet of Things. We have software that is no longer just written by humans, but we have software that is written increasingly by AIs. And we have software manipulating not just physics, but software manipulating biology. There are four quarters of this picture. The top is hardware, the bottom is software, the left is physics, the right is biology. But the most important thing is the convergence, the feedback cycles. Progress in any one of these quadrants enables other progress elsewhere. And we could spend a long time looking at these positive influences. I'll just look at one. Nanotech means we have better sensors, not just better computers, better sensors that can do what? It can give us more information about what's happening deep inside people's brains as they are being creative or intuitive or meditating and so on. And as we understand that without having to cut people's skulls open, our better understanding of the brain operation allows us to copy some of these aspects into our new AI models. And it's no surprise that many of the world's leading AI companies have hired large numbers of PhDs in neurotech, brain experts. And better AI leads to better development of drugs and so forth. Indeed, just to underscore that, here are the four quadrants again. Nanotech improves health by precisely targeted drug delivery, by nanosurgery and nanobots. Biotech has numerous advantages, stem cells, epigenetics, senolytics. Infotech enables the discovery of new medical solutions via AI and big data. And cognotech, which hasn't been so developed yet, but I believe is going to accelerate, will result in smarter, more creative, more focused, less egocentric researchers. We can summarize that as more collaboration. Infotech leads us to being better informed, better educated. Biotech leads us to have a wider range of options, and even if some turn out to fail, others can succeed. And nanotech gives us greater accuracy and efficiency. So of these positive accelerators, that may be the most significant one yet. And it's still early days for that fourth industrial revolution, but there is very encouraging progress all over. And with the better tools, we can take advantage of these ideas and we can unleash more people to be productive. And what's that going to result in? It could result in a big change in the public mood. The people who are presently unsure whether they want to get behind this, they will see demonstrations. They will see not just fruit flies living longer or elegance worms living longer, which doesn't excite them so much, but they will increasingly see pet dogs living longer and healthily. They will also see biotech, biomarkers of aging being significantly changed as a result of interventions in humans. They will see humans whose gray hairs seem to disappear and who have new springs in their steps. They will see people breaking records for the performance in athletics at various age levels. And they'll say, this seems to be working. And in that case, they will be more interested in the whole range of other arguments, including the economic arguments, the longevity arguments as to why it makes so much sense for society to invest in this research now and save on money in elder care and sick care. And they will be more open to the humanitarian arguments. And there will be a flip, a change, a transition, a disruption. Whereas throughout history, most people have sort of accepted aging as an inevitable fact of life. And although when people are young, they have fought against it and said, this is unfair, by the time they get a bit older, they're told by their parents and by their elders and by their religious leaders usually, you've got to learn to accept it. And there's this famous prayer, which Reinhold Niebuhr helped to popularize, that German theologian, God give us the serenity to accept what cannot be changed. And one of the central principles of another great world religion, Buddhism, is give up the desire for life, prepare to die, contemplate your own death and get used to the idea. But That very same prayer, the Serenity Prayer, has another clause: give us the courage to change what can be changed, and give us the wisdom to know the one from the other. So what the public are going to understand, they're going to increasingly become wise to see the possibilities of this field. They're going to recognize that aging is not a fact of life. It is a technical problem with a technical solution within grasp. And that old acceptance paradigm is going to be displaced by an abolitionist fervor. And with more people demanding change, expressing interest in change, it will lead to politicians applying more public funding in this field. It will lead to more of our youngsters deciding to study this. It will lead to more professors offering courses in this field, and to more companies being patient in their research. So there we are. There is the situation as I painted it in 2016, looking ahead to 2040. And it was my judgment that these sets of arguments were roughly evenly balanced. But to bring matters up to date in the next few minutes, how do I assess progress in each of these 10 fields in the meantime? So let's briefly look again at each of these 10 arguments. How are we doing with building a larger community? I think the progress is pretty good. I don't have an exact numerical measure for how many people are cooperating well, but there's plenty of signs that the field is getting significantly larger. We can look at the rejuvenation roadmap published on lifespan.io. We can look at the remarkable research that's gathered together by Forever Healthy, by Michael Graver. There's all the work, of course, that Bill Falloon is marshalling and publicizing and spreading. Every time I look at that, there are more interesting people involved. There is research that is being organized and structured on a longevity wiki. There is a Vita DAO, which is applying money raised by cryptocurrencies and donations into whole new research fields. And there are traditional funds, such as the Longevity Vision Fund of Sergey Young. There is the political initiative, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, to change the laws regarding how quickly new drugs can be developed and tested. There is funds such as Jim Mellon's Juvenescence, which has raised very impressive amounts of money. There is another crypto group, Pulse Chain, that raised a huge amount of money recently for the SENS Research Foundation and other initiatives. So I would say good progress there. How are the mega IT companies doing? The Alphabets and Amazons and so forth. Well, at first sight, there is some setbacks. People are broadly disappointed with how little seems to have come out of Calico yet. But this is where I refer back to my opening remarks. This is quite typical for disruptions. Bear in mind there is a period of slow progress, disappointing progress, often before the dramatic breakthroughs and disruptions happen. So what Calico is doing, including their research on naked mole rats, is, I believe, accumulating in its power. And what has been learned from the possible disappointments with Calico are being reapplied with some of the same people and some new people in Altos Labs. So I think there is ongoing progress there too. What about acceptance by more people of this different organizing principle, the aging first approach to disease rather than the disease first approach? It's too early to tell for sure, but I have seen more documents published that tell public as a whole to change their minds. Recently, I saw something from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Tony Blair was the British Prime Minister for nearly a decade. On leaving office, he set up a very interesting group to look at tackling the biggest problems in the world. And at the end of last year, 3 of his scientific researchers basically said politicians should switch to an aging first approach to tackling disease. Very impressive. There's possibility that this change in organizing principles might actually have a new wave of disruption in it. As I said at the beginning, disruption happens in waves. There may be a simplification. Then instead of thinking we need to solve all 7 types of damage, if we look at the SENS analysis, are all 9 or 10 hallmarks of aging. If we look at how other people break it down, we might discover, we might intuit, we might have evidence that some hallmarks are the ones with primary importance. So that conceptual revolution may have yet more acceleration and yet more goods from it. How are we doing with progress with NBIC technologies? Some good progress, some very impressive progress, particularly in AI. Biotech, I think, is broadly on course. Nanotech is slow, and I think that is a field where government should invest a lot more. But on the whole, again, I think this is on schedule. And in terms of a public mood change, again, it's too early to see evidence of a huge swing, but the things that I saw at the very beginning of this meeting, that marvelous documentary on longevity hackers, there are lots of people with marketing skills, with video skills, who are, we might say, doing meme engineering or doing marketing to change the public opinion. So to summarize what I've just said, I think there is broad good progress on all of these accelerators. What about the other side of the equation? Is there any more evidence that the field of aging is too complicated? No, no new evidence. And yes, people point to things that might be quite hard to solve, but there is nothing fundamental that's being discovered and nothing that could not be solved in principle by enough people trying enough approaches. How about whether this public discussion of science is going positively or negatively? Here, I think there is a mixed story, particularly if we look at the example of COVID. COVID has many remarkable things in its story, including very fast development and rollout of numerous vaccines. So that's good. But if we look at what many scientists have said in their public arguments on Twitter and elsewhere, a lot of it is pretty depressing, how they have moved away from what the science actually will warrant, and they have sometimes taken views for political reasons or tribal reasons. So that has seen, sadly, too much irrationality, more than I had expected in such public discussions. How is our community doing? Is there infighting or fragmentation? Well, there's a lot of great data sharing through some of the initiatives I already mentioned. Are we driving out bad examples? Mostly, although sometimes we are, in our enthusiasm, too uncritical over solutions which don't have enough evidence in their favor, but I think we're getting better on that. So yes, there is some infighting, but nothing that can't be managed. In terms of a growth in accepting aging as being the primary view, it's still early to tell. It could flip either way, and whether it's going to flip one way or the other will depend on progress with demonstrations, progress with the meme engineering, which I talked about. So I'm not worried on that. But as for general social chaos, been a lot of bad things happening in the last 6 years or so. And that, frankly, is an increasing concern of mine. And I have to say, I am more worried by what I might call landmines, things that might destroy society's capacity to think truly rationally and scientifically. I don't have time to go into this in depth. I'll be drawing my remarks to an end in a moment, and we'll enter the Q&A phase. But in my book, Vital Foresight, I describe a series of 11 landmines, things that are lurking underfoot, and we're only dimly aware of them, but they might explode, literally or metaphorically, and seriously damage our ability to move forwards. In my book, I look at the causes and risks of each of these 11 landmines. I look at how we might monitor them through canary signals to see whether they might be becoming more dangerous. And I talk about solutions too. So I won't go into all of them in depth, but there is here a quick summary. There are more people who feel themselves as being left behind. That's individual people, groups of people, and even countries who feel that the world doesn't respect them enough. They suffer economic decline. In the past, each generation generally had a better standard of living, a better income than before. Nowadays, there are in some parts of society a decline in income from one generation to the next. People see a lack of mobility opportunities. They feel they are being disrespected and that culture as a whole is not giving them the validation they need. What does this lead to? Sadly, it leads to more deaths of despair, with people either taking their own lives consciously or getting into terrible habits which decline their health. It's not good for society to be so divided, and the worst possible thing that might happen is a small number, a small fraction of these people might seek revenge or notoriety or some kind of perverse validation by acts of outrage, getting their hands on the technology, which I mentioned. This industrial revolution brings more potential for good, but more potential for harm, from extreme religious groups, extreme political groups, from countries that feel they are being left behind and access weapons of various sorts, including biotech hazards and including infotech hazards. And we should also look at the risks of financial instabilities. Each of these last three, by the way, what makes them dangerous is we have shared infrastructure. We have a shared biology. We increasingly have a shared IT infrastructure that's vulnerable to hacking. And we have a shared financial system, which had a big shock in 2008, 2009, and might have other big shocks ahead. As well as financial instabilities, we could talk about environmental instabilities, political instabilities. We could talk about cancers within society, in which groups in society of various sorts, which are themselves useful, but might gain too much blood, as it were, too much resources, and do damage, whether it's through crony capitalism or political parties that destroy meaningful opposition and they have too much power. There's a meta landmine of reason under threat with the growth of people believing clever but wrong conspiracy theories, and with malware, which creates smart bots, smart trolls. We have risks on the international level. The prospects of a nuclear war are back in the news recently that we thought we might have transcended. And we could talk also about a surprising development, which is as we come closer to rejuvenation technologies, many people will love it, but some people, out of a perverse psychology, will hate it. And we already see this recently when a journalist I know in the UK published just a couple of days ago an article saying, well, we could make big progress with longevity. People could live to 150. Lots of apparently clever people poured scorn on this idea, coming up with all kinds of spurious reasons. This is bad. This is immoral. This is selfish. And as we come closer, some of that psychology may wreak more havoc. Let me sum up. I think the stuff on the left hasn't changed much, but I am increasingly worried, more worried now in 2022 than I was in 2016 about irrationality spreading. We are getting stupider as well as getting cleverer, and more general social chaos. So I can no longer, with my hand in my heart, say I think the probability of getting there is balanced at 50%. I have to say that probability has come down, in my view, perhaps to 40%. But that's not the end of the story, because of course we could do things. If we apply our resources wisely, we can address these landmines and we can ensure that the public discussion becomes more rational again. And that's what I write about in my book. I claim there are no easy solutions to any of these landmines. If there were easy solutions, we would have done them already. But broadly, if we can apply the best of humanity, the best of our science, the best of our willingness to cooperate openly, the best of our ability to take solutions from technology and help us, the best of paying attention to possible adverse developments, the best of people exerting individual agency, accepting diverse opinions and working together responsibly, then we can tame these landmines and increase again the probability that we'll get to where we're going. Well, I said a lot. I rushed over quite a lot. You can find 400 pages of argument in my Abolition of Aging book, and shockingly 642 pages of argument in my Vital Foresight book, in which I look more generally at how we can use skills of foresight to understand how technology can build a much better world in a more secure way. And I'll end with a simple picture. What I've talked about is the possibility for technology to accelerate. I've drawn this as a straight line, but we can also imagine an exponential curve. If that works well, if the fourth industrial revolution develops as it could, we could get to a marvelous future of super longevity and super intelligence and super happiness, super abundance by 2040. But there is a race on. There are bad things happening in society too, which could get worse. So which of these two runners in the race is going to get to the finishing line first? Well, it depends on other players. It depends on to what extent can we truly collaborate in a productive way. It depends on how much education we can spread to raise people's understanding of the good solutions. And it depends in a very critical way on whether a positive, perpetual life mindset, forever young mindset, mindset for abolishing aging, whether that's going to predominate or whether we're going to be dominated by small scale thinking instead. And I wish you all to join with me, join with the Church of Perpetual Life, join with many other allies in this grand collaboration to ensure that we get a positive future rather than these crises undermining things which are within our grasp. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was tremendous. What a great overview and what a great point of view that you have. Appreciate you being with us tonight. We have a few questions here for you. And the first is, what can the average person do to increase the possibility for age reversal to come in the coming years? What can the average person do to increase that?
It depends on people's strengths and skills. So if people are skilled at building communities, if they are good at connecting people, then get involved in supporting diverse people to feel comfortable cooperating. If people have got access to finance, if they are able to raise funds and encourage others to raise funds, then make sure that that funding is applied to the initiatives such as SENS Research Foundation projects of Aubrey de Grey, such as the work that Bill Falloon is championing, so they can apply that. But many other people can operate with skills such as marketing to spread good memes, to understand how people are reacting to these ideas and find alternative ways to explain the answers. And very importantly, more of us can get involved in the science too, if we have some appreciation of science or on artificial intelligence. Many people are able to benefit from the wonderful range of information that's online these days. And after a period of time, each person can maybe start asking good questions, proposing ideas on how some of these solutions can be tested and developed and raised further. So there are multiple answers to this, and it depends on each person. And one way to find out how each of us can contribute is not by thinking about it by ourselves, but talking with people that we really trust, people who are also part of this community. By having honest discussions with people who are also part of this community, they can give us suggestions how each of us can use our own talents to support this cause.
Yes, yes, thank you. A question came in from the live stream regarding whether these technologies that could be available for age reversal, that might be a something for the entire population. Is there a way that you can see, or how do you feel that, will this be available for everyone or for a select few? What's your opinion of that?
There are different scenarios in how this might play out. It might be that a technology is developed which is already reliable, but which is very expensive, and to an extent some of the genetic reprogramming or stem cell therapies, they are expensive currently. But what we can look to is much the same as has happened in other fields, that with innovation, with pressures, the costs can come down very significantly. There's nothing guaranteed about this in my view, but with the right political pressure, there will be reasons for governments to get behind it. After all, the public will demand access to these solutions, and any political parties who say they're not going to develop what could be much cheaper solutions will find it hard to be elected back into power. And these same governments should realize the economic argument, which is once we invest more to reduce the costs, then the cost of treatment and make them more widely available, we will no longer, as a government, have to pay people, pay to look after people who are increasingly sick or ill at later stages. Another way in which this might happen is that the treatments are still uncertain. And even the wealthiest in society may not want to apply these techniques to themselves until they have been more widely tested. And in order for something to be widely tested, you have to bring down the cost. So there's another reason why everybody will be motivated to find ways to bring down the cost. If we look at multiple fields, the costs of many technologies have come down remarkably over years and decades. And I see no reason fundamentally why that should not happen in our case as well. But I do caution people not to be glib about this. There are some bad examples of various health solutions which remain at a high cost, despite it would be more sensible if they were cheaper. The cost of insulin in some parts of the world is remarkably high still, and that is where some political pressures may help. So to give one more answer to what I mentioned earlier, how can people make a difference? If people have skills in political activism, they should get involved in alerting politicians of the benefits and ensuring that there is public pressure backed up by political actions to ensure that these solutions, as quickly as possible, become completely widely available.
Yes, thank you for that. There's a question. You had mentioned a recent publication a few days ago, and someone would like to see if they can read this online. Can you tell us a little bit more about this publication?
It was an article by, let's see if I can remember this, somebody called Tom Goodwin. Definitely an article online which provoked, I thought, a lot of disappointing, smart, but not smart comments, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yes, yes. I know the article you're talking about. I believe that we have a copy of it. But even so, after our event tonight, perhaps we can talk about this more, and I'll get the information over to our viewer, our listener, and share that with them and anyone else that's interested in that. But yes,
I apologize if I've got the name of the person wrong.
All right. Here, I have another question for you from Ted. How important do you believe the new perspectives of economic, political, and social organization are?
Well, it's a bit like the progress that was made in software when people adopted the radical new ideas of open source. At first, open source was viewed as crazy. How could it be progress if so many people are involved? You need to keep this software secret and not to share that. But it turned out that that's how many of the most successful software projects have been developed. So the Mozilla browser, Firefox browser, the Chrome browser, wonderful pieces of software in many ways, and the Linux operating system give rise to Android. The iPhone itself is not open source, but there are many, many open source components in there. And it's hard for us to remember now, but it was a very controversial idea that there could be this cooperation. But Linus Torvalds, the person behind Linux, he is credited with a law on his name which says, with enough eyeballs, every bug is shallow. Enough people looking at things, you get a different perspective. So that outperformed what was previously called the cathedral, the idea that complicated software needed to be controlled in a way that you build a cathedral. Whereas the alternative, and this is to quote a writer called Eric Raymond, he had a famous essay called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. The bazaar seems like chaos. There's lots of people shouting and calling out, how could anything successful arise? And open source is a bit like that, but it made progress. Well, I think it's the same in many other fields of science. There has been traditional methods of having very careful peer review and long, slow publication processes, and that's has much to commend it. But nowadays we have more preprints being published online. We have more independent people accessing them. I don't want to say we should move away from peer review, but it is great that we have earlier access to some ideas that can change things more quickly. So the pace of change has increased, and that's important too. And then there's the community decision as to which projects should be funded. And in the past, funding decisions have often been taken by, quote, wise individuals who sometimes make great calls, but sometimes get stuck in their own limited thinking. And sometimes it's been driven by people pursuing quick profits, quick financial returns. Well, with communities and decentralized autonomous organizations, so-called DAOs, there is more possibility that the communities will steer funding to projects that would be missed out by previous mechanisms. So this diversity of approach is to be welcomed. We should still be critical about it. We should still reflect on what works and what doesn't work. We shouldn't be naive in just jumping alongside something because it's new. Often the old methods have a lot to commend them, but it is probably a combination of the wisdom of the old methods and the brilliance of some new methods that will get us to the future we desire. Steve has got his electronic hand up.
Yes, you do. Steve, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Not really a question, but just a very short statement. I'm Steve Buss. I'm an independent longevity science researcher. I have a research collaborator named Vince Giuliano. He is the blogger at Anti-Aging Firewalls. Vince and I spoke to the London Futurists meetup. We were happy that David Wood asked us to speak, or we approached him about speaking, and we spoke at a meetup of London Futurists on November 20th of last year. Neil, I appreciated your statement that you believe that far from there being impulses in us toward death, that there are impulses toward life in the universe and in us, the implication maybe being within us. David, I appreciated your statement that one problem, it has to do with the signal to noise ratio, right? There are a huge number of studies. How do you figure out what's important? Vince and I believe, we're just independent researchers. We don't have mice. We don't do experiments. We just read abstracts. And Vince has several tens of thousands of hours in research in. I have a whole lot more, probably something like 15,000 over 20 years of hours of research and writing and thinking about the literature. We think the key studies that clarified what the signal is were only published in 2015 and 2017. We think it was impossible to, virtually impossible, to figure out what the signal is about evolution's impulse toward life until then. And specifically, we mean Morimoto 2015 and Seth Grant 2017. So we spoke at David's meetup on November 20th. We've done 2 lectures in more detail on the 2 major mechanisms that are within us that can be triggered consciously for rejuvenation at Oregon State University, and we'll be posting the YouTube videos of those talks in the next few days. And then we're doing a second talk at London Futurists on April 9th to talk about interventions to trigger these 2 mechanisms. We call this theory, we call it the programmed younging theory of aging and rejuvenation. And we are trying to get our ideas out there. We think we figured out something important, but we're fallibilists, so we're open to being corrected about our beliefs.
So I think that's a very interesting line of research. I'm glad to have the opportunity in London Futurists to give you a window to an audience, and the discussions that we had last time was fascinating. I'm expecting the same next time. The general point here is that sometimes takes a while to build up a sufficient body of knowledge, which can then be studied in a new way and give light to a different understanding, which could not take place before. It's almost like steam engines were developed for a while and people tinkered with them, and only then were engineers replaced by scientists, people like Lord Kelvin and others who came up with the science of thermodynamics and allowed a next wave of improvements in the design of many engines. So I think it's possibly what's happening here. There's been a lot of incremental development, and we could now see a new paradigm change. That's what I hinted at in my remarks, saying we have had some progress with a paradigm change from switching from disease first approach to aging first approach, but that could only be maybe the start to a new paradigm change. And I don't quite know what that successful new paradigm change will be, but it could be this younging hypothesis that Vince Giuliano and Steve Buss have developed.
There was one question in the live stream, and it was very similar to the first question that we had this evening. And it was, what can one man do that has limited funds to advance this process of age reversal? Perhaps you have some parting comments on that, David?
So each person can educate themselves, they can find good resources, and they can share these good resources through their own communities. And it might be a link to a video, it might be recommending a book. I think we have got new books all the time which deserve to be read. My own favorite recent book on the science of aging is by a young British researcher called Andrew Steele, and I recommend everybody to read his book on Ageless. It's got a picture of a turtle on the front, and turtles are a species that appears to be negligibly senescent. Andrew is a wonderful communicator, and what everybody can do is, if they find a book like that which they like, they can recommend to other people to read it, because books are relatively low cost. And by the way, that speaker, Andrew Steele, spoke last week at London's prestigious Royal Institution. He gave a talk about his book. The Royal Institution is the same place where Michael Faraday gave his famous lectures in the 1830s about electromagnetism. That building is where no fewer than 10 different chemical elements were discovered. It is a remarkable center of scientific life in the United Kingdom, and it was marvelous to have Andrew Steele effectively giving a version of the same talk that I gave, with much more focus on the science. And the questions he got were nearly always, what about overpopulation? What about inequality? Won't it be boring, and so forth? So he answered them very well too. So it's great to see these arguments spreading more widely, and each of us can find at least a few people that we can talk to and influence. Maybe we can't do so much ourselves, but we can pass on the light or the fire, and somebody that we pass it on to could be the connector, who in turn will connect to even larger communities, will apply more funds, will have the scientific breakthrough, will waken up politicians, or in some other ways significantly advance our cause. So our power will be multiplied by the extent to which we can connect to others who can take that energy further.
Well said, David. That's exactly right. Thank you for that comment. Oh my goodness. So our event tonight has been recorded and will be available just after we close. You can find it through our YouTube channel, and there's a link at the top of our website. I'd like to thank David. I'd like to thank you very much for being here. So glad you were here, and we appreciate your presentation tonight.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed preparing it, and the questions were great, and the community discussion beforehand has been good, and I look forward to continuing that in the Zoom party now for those who are on board.
That's right. And remember, next month we'll have Bill Falloon. We'll be live and in person, our presentation at our new church in Pompano Beach. We'll also be Zooming the event, and this is going to be the third Thursday in April, April 21st. Our Zoom party will begin at 6 and our live stream at 7 p.m. I want to thank all of you for attending our live stream this month. Be sure to get our monthly email newsletters for updates on age reversal and all of the scientific advances that we are seeing, and things that can help you to live a longer and healthier life. Please share the recording of this event with all of the people that you care about, and join us again next month. for another life. Good night.
It's called Forever Young. May the good Lord be with you down every road you roll. And may sunshine and happiness surround you when you're far from home. And may you grow to be proud, dignified and true. And do unto others as you'd have done to you. Be courageous and be brave, and in my heart you'll always stay. Forever young, forever young, forever young, forever young. May good fortune be with you, may your guiding light be strong. Build a stairway to heaven with a prince or a vagabond. And may you never love in vain. And in my heart you will remain. Forever young, forever young, forever young, forever young. Forever young. Forever young. Forever young. And when you finally fly away, I'll be hoping that I served you well. For all the wisdom of a lifetime, no one can ever tell. But whatever road you choose, I'm right behind you, win or lose. Forever young.